Hello everyone and welcome to The Wild Side. I'm your host, Kight, and that was Mika Snow singing Animal. And in case you are knowledgeable about Mika Snow, you might notice that that was specifically the Mark Ronson remix of that song. And I chose that song to start us off today because I want to talk about animals, and in particular I want to think about mammals. The reason I've decided to focus on mammals is that, well, of course, we are mammals, and it's always kind of nice to know more about us and the animals that we're closely related to. But also I've been working on some mammal-based stuff for some researchers up at the University of Exeter. And so I've been reading lots and lots of lectures and essays and all sorts of papers about mammals. And I never really did much zoological stuff before, so this is the first time I've really thought about all these things and learned a bunch of this stuff. And I've actually discovered lots of really interesting and unusual facts, and I've kind of expanded my knowledge in a way that has been really interesting to me, so I thought that maybe some other people might also find all of this stuff quite enlightening and maybe even a bit useful. So this is all going to be about what mammals are and kind of the characteristics that all mammals have in common, something about our evolutionary history and some of the interesting stuff that we do as a group. And then maybe if you guys think this is kind of a good direction to go in, I might have another show coming up in the future where I do kind of a second part or even a third part going into some further stuff, because really I'm just going to scratch the surface today of what there is to talk about. So if you do listen to the show today and you like what you hear, you should definitely think about dropping me a line through the Wildside webpage or through the source Twitter or Facebook accounts, or even through my own personal accounts, which are also linked to everything else. So definitely get in touch if you want to hear more about mammals, or if you have any other suggestions about topics that I could address in the future on the Wild Side. So to start us off with, let's think about what actually is a mammal. And I think a lot of us might feel that we are familiar with the concept of a mammal, but if you were to ask some more scientific clarification of what defines a mammal, I think a lot of us would come up short, and I certainly would. So first of all, I think the easiest way to do this is to think about the shared features that are found within the mammalian group that distinguish us from other animals and other groups. Because of course the animal kingdom is huge, and it contains things like reptiles and birds and insects, which are obviously quite different from mammals. So first of all, one thing that distinguishes us from some of those other groups is that we have a backbone. We are vertebrates. And the backbone is the segmented series of bones that are separated by mobile joints. And of course you are familiar with that concept since we have our own spine and we know how it functions. And that is quite different from what we find in some of the other organisms. Some organisms have no kind of backbone type thing at all. Others do have a backbone, but it functions in a different way. It kind of has a different physical structure. So ours is the one that has that segmented nature and is quite flexible and able to move. Now other chordates, so other animals that also have a backbone, include things like several types of fish and amphibians and reptiles and birds as well. So this is something that we share in common with a lot of things, but it does distinguish us from stuff like certain types of fish, from insects, as I mentioned, from things like echinoderms, octopi, squid, that sort of thing. Now the next thing that is a really important characteristic of mammals is that we are craniates, which means that we have heads. And this does set us apart from some of the other chordates that have a spinal column, but they don't have heads. So that's things like tunicates and lancelets, which do have, they might have a feature that's very clearly kind of head-like, but it isn't, it doesn't feature a skull. It's not like the head that we have and the rest of mammals have. Another feature that we have is a jaw, and this means that we're gnathostomes. And this group, the gnathostomes, sorry, this is very hard to say, gnathostomes includes about 99% of all living vertebrates. So the bulk of vertebrates do have jaws that are kind of recognizable. They're somewhat similar to our own, so we would definitely distinguish them as jaws. And these are probably a feature that evolved because back in the day when we started off, we were in the water and we had gills that were we were using those in order to get oxygen out of the water and to breathe. And one of the things that would have been really useful is if we had some sort of a structure that could enhance that process. So maybe there was some of the gill arches that were, surrounding that structure might have been modified over time to help pump in some water so that you could pump in more water to go over the gills and to expose them to more oxygen to help improve breathing. And over time, that pumping mechanism would have become more and more specialized and more recognizable as this kind of flap in the bottom of the mouth area. And that eventually is what led into the jaw structure that we have today. So something that was originally used for breathing, we now use for some very different purposes. Of course, we use it to speak, we use it whenever we're eating, and I'll go into some of those things a little bit more in detail later on. But this obviously is a very different origin from the way that it's used today. Now, another thing that distinguishes mammals is that we are tetrapods. And if you look at the root words in that word, then you'll know that tetra means four, and pod refers to the limbs. So we are organisms that have four limbs and hands or feet attached to those limbs. And tetrapods evolved from the lobe-finned fishes, a particular group of fishes, about 395 million years ago. And the process surrounding this is actually not very well understood. There are some examples of fish that seem to have kind of some of these characteristics that you could easily see might eventually be modified in time, so that they would give rise to tetrapodia and they would give rise to the sort of organism that we are today. So there are some of these fish that are able to kind of hop around and move from one pool to another over big spaces of land by kind of using their fins like feet. And it allows them to cover a lot more distance and to survive out in the air, out in the heat, because it allows them to get to shade, it allows them to get to water. So you can see why these structures would have been very useful, but we have had some trouble locating some of the organisms, some of the fossils and some of the living organisms that may have been descendant from these things in order to really piece this process together. But it is pretty clear that that is what happened. Now, really starting to get into the specialization of mammals, the next feature that distinguishes us is that we're amniotes, and this means that we have an egg that's adapted to terrestrial conditions. And when I say that, I don't always mean that amniotes are actually going to be breeding on land. Of course, we know there are some aquatic mammals that do breeding activities in the water, so things like whales and dolphins. But what this means is that you don't have to have a body of water available so that the animals can go back to that body of water and drop their eggs into it. So if you think about things like amphibians that would go and lay their eggs in the water and then have, the female would do that and then the male would come along and fertilize it. That's something that you often see in fish species as well and lots of other aquatic organisms. We don't have to have that body of water to facilitate the breeding process or the maturation of the egg. And this is because we are able to produce eggs that are protected from their environment. They're protected from the fact that it's much warmer, and then it can also be much drier and just a much harsher environment out there on land because it's so much closer to the sun. And there can be really big fluctuations in conditions, whereas in the water you can often have kind of a steady environment. And so this adapted egg, it contains something called an amnios, and an amnios is the elastic pouch in which the embryo develops. And of course we've all seen these if you've ever cracked open an egg and you get that little filmy thing in the middle that you have to kind of peel off. You'll often notice this if you hard boil an egg, and in between the shell and the stuff that you're going to eat is that little skin bit that you want to peel off, and that is the amnios, and that is something that all mammalian eggs have. And it's kind of critical to us because it does allow us to function on land and have the breeding that we do have. And this really separates us from a lot of the organisms that we evolved from. And finally, the last thing to mention that really distinguishes us from the other organisms in our animal family is that we are something called synapsids. And this means that we have a feature called temporal fenestrae. And again, to look at the roots of those words, temporal means near the temple, and fenestrae refers to something that's a window-like structure. And this refers to basically holes in the skull. And if you've ever seen a human skull, and you'll think, well, actually, I can't remember seeing any holes. They're just the eye sockets and the nose socket, and that's about it. And that is true. So in humans, we have actually lost that feature. It has changed over time. But even so, if you look at a human skull, you'll notice that there are big indentations in the temporal area. And it does kind of, it goes in where the temple is and then it juts out a bit, again, kind of at the top of the cheekbone. And that is where those openings used to be before we lost that feature. And in other organisms, if you get online and do a bit of Googling and you look for skulls, you will notice those holes are still there today. And it's actually quite an interesting thing, and I will add some of those to the Wildside webpage when I update it, so that you can kind of compare the huge difference in the human skull and the skulls of some of our close relatives. Now, in any case, why would we have these holes? That seems like kind of a dangerous thing since the skull is there to protect us. Well, the idea is that it's associated with jaw musculature. So as we evolved this jaw-like feature from the gill arch support structures, we needed something to hold it in place and to help it maneuver in order to be efficient. And having those holes there allowed the musculature to develop so that it could be sufficient to do all the stuff that the jaw needed to do. And this is a really important feature because it is the major thing that makes that last cutoff between us and our other relatives in the animal family tree. So all these other things have kind of been separating us little by little from the other things that are related to us. But this is the real thing that separates mammals from our other closest relatives, which are the reptiles and birds. So if you look at the family tree, you'll find that about 324 million years ago, all of us did have a common ancestor. And one group that shot off contained the mammals, and all these guys did start to have these holes in the skull and all these other features I described. But the other group, including things like dinosaurs and amphibians and reptiles and turtles and all that stuff, those guys didn't have any of these same structures. And those guys were called sauropsids. As I said before, we're called synapsids. And so we are the group that is distinct from all those other things. Now, thinking a little bit more about that split that happened about 300 million years ago, obviously, if we are so closely related to these other organisms, you might expect that some of our earliest ancestors were actually quite reptile-like. We had the same ancestor at some point that evolved over time and gave rise to new species, and so we did have something in common with all these other things. We do, in fact, still have a lot of shared traits. For example, like I mentioned earlier, we are all vertebrates. So Amniota does have lots of things, lots of organisms included within it. And if you look back and you look at some of the earliest species, not quite in our group, but kind of leading into our group, they do look very much like reptiles and these animals in that other group. So for example, if you look at Dimetrodon, there are some 20 species in this genus, Dimetrodon. And these guys lived about 300 million years ago, and they were quite common, probably around the world actually, but there are a lot of fossil samples that come from the southwestern portion of the US. And there's also one sample, only a single sample, that was found in Germany, so they are a bit closer to us as well. And these guys probably looked a bit like a gigantic monitor lizard, and they were quite large, and they had a big sail that stuck up on their back, and it was basically, they had a bunch of elongated spines along their vertebrae, and in between this would have been stretched kind of a skin-like feature or a very firm leathery kind of structure. And so they had this big sail. And this, you can think of a lot of dinosaurs you've seen pictures of that probably kind of look like this. And in fact, if you were shown a picture of a Dimetrodon, you might actually think that it is a dinosaur. But actually they went extinct before dinosaurs evolved. And there are a lot of interesting features that we see, that we can glean about these guys if you look at their fossils, that suggest that they had lives that were not unlike the lives of many mammals. So for example, we know that they inhabited wetland areas, and they were probably a top predator, which means that they would have had a varied diet of things that they could have hunted down within that wetland ecosystem. And if they're in the wetland, that means that they can kind of deal with water, but also deal with dryness. They can probably deal with cooler temperatures and also slightly warmer temperatures, so they're able to kind of tolerate kind of a range of environmental conditions, which is true of many mammals that we see today. Now, if you move a bit further on, you can find organisms that are much more clearly not reptiles. So the Dimetrodon was a very early ancestor that still retained a lot of those reptilian traits. But if you move on a bit further, so about 100 million years, or about 200 million years ago total, you can find organisms that really are like some of the very earliest mammals, that were true mammals, that even have descendants living today that are quite similar. So a great example of this is an organism called the Morganocodon. And fossils from this species, group of species, were very common, in particular from whales. However, it was probably more widespread than that, but there are lots of good examples right from basically our own doorstep. And this was, people argue over whether this is a true mammal or not, because it does have some features that suggest that it's not quite to the point of what we would classify as a mammal just yet, but it is very recognizable as being a precursor to mammals and very, very close. So for example, it's small, it's furry, it's plantigrade, which means that it stands the way that we do with the feet, both the hands and the feet, because it is on all fours, completely touching the ground. The palms are all the way down onto the ground. It would have had quite a long tail. And so if you think about all these features together, basically what we're talking about is something that looks like a shrew or a mouse, only it was a little bit bigger than that. It was probably about rat-sized. And one of the interesting things about this species is that it had hind feet that may have been equipped with a venomous spur. And this is a really unusual trait for a mammal, but if you know anything about your zoology, you might already be familiar with the fact that there are some mammals that do have these venomous spurs even today. And those are the monotremes, so things like echidnas and also platypus. And echidnas have the spurs, but they don't really use them in the way that the Morganocodon would have, but the platypuses definitely do. And there are also lots of examples from the fossil record of other related species that have these spurs as well. So this is one of the reasons why the Morganocodon is recognized as a very close relative of those basal mammals, because it has this trait that it would have passed on to them and that they carry on even to this day. Now, in terms of how it acted, it was probably also quite mammalian in its behaviors. It was most likely nocturnal. It would have been a burrowing sort of animal, the way that mice are, the way that chipmunks are. It was probably an insectivore. And again, being an insectivore is something that we do see in a lot of these early mammals, so the monotremes, for example. And I'll talk about those guys in a bit more detail in a minute. But basically it is like some of these animals that we do see today, and it probably would have laid small leathery eggs, which again is what we find in echidnas and platypuses. So it is beginning to move away from the reptiles, even though it does still have some of those reptilian traits. It's becoming very clearly mammalian. And whether or not you want to argue that it's an actual mammal or just a pre-mammal, based on the way that its jaw looks, you definitely can recognize that this is something that gave rise to the group that we are in today. And the whole reason that there is this argument is that if you look at the jaw bones, you can look at the position and the type of the joints and also the movement of the bones and where the different bones are placed. And there's a big shift that occurs between the reptiles and the mammals. And Morganocodon was kind of in the middle of that shift. And that's actually something that I will talk a bit more about in a minute. But before I go into that, I'll give you a little bit of a break so you can process all of that morphological and fossil information. And I'll play Neko Case singing Lion's Jaws. Welcome back to The Wild Side. If you're just joining us, that was Neko Case singing Lion's Jaws. And today, here on The Source, I am talking about mammals and the evolution of mammals and some of the characteristics that mammals share with each other and also with some of the other animals in the animal kingdom. And just before the break, I was talking about some important shifts that occurred to really distinguish mammals from the other group that we are classified next to our sister group, if you like, and those are the reptiles and amphibians and birds and dinosaurs and all those other, what they're called is sauropsids, and we are synapsids. And so we do have lots of things in common with these guys, but there are a few things that distinguish us. And actually the really major thing, if you want to look at the fossil record or look at a skeleton of something that you have found, if you want to distinguish whether it's a reptile or a mammal, what you need to do is look at the jaw area and the rest of the skull. And the reason for this is that reptiles have a mandible that has multiple small bones, and the mandible is what we would refer to as the jaw, that lower bit that flaps up and down when you're eating and talking. And if you look at their jaw, they have lots of little bits that fit together. One of those bits holds the teeth, but other bits are just kind of under that as a support structure. Other bits are what attach it to the main part of the skull. They've got lots of things going on in there. And if you look at the area that attaches that mandible to the rest of the cranium, what you'll find is that a particular bone called the articular bone is the bit of the lower jaw that is attaching to the cranium, and it does this at a point called the quadrate. So what they have is the articular quadrate jaw joint. And you don't really have to remember the specifics of that, but the idea is that they do have two particular bones that are involved in making that junction between those two features. In mammals, though, what you find is that we have a single bone on the lower jaw that houses all of our teeth, and this bone is called the dentary. And this bone creates our jaw by hinging to the squamosal bone. So here we have two completely different bones involved in attaching that lower structure of the face, if you like, of the mouth to the rest of the head. And so we have a very different jaw structure than our relatives in the reptile family. And what you can also find is that we have these extra bones, these extra little bones that the reptiles have that we don't have. They either disappeared completely or they migrated elsewhere. So for example, the little tiny bones that we have in our inner ear result from some of those other bones that reptiles had elsewhere. So the articular bone that they had involved in that joint in the cranium, that became the malleus of our inner ear. And the incus, which is the other bone that we have in our inner ear, that's derived from a cranial bone in the reptiles, the quadrate that I mentioned earlier. So we have a very different structure is the basic point that you want to take away from that. And by examining the skull and the jaw in particular, you can determine whether something is kind of in that group with the reptiles and the birds and the amphibians and the dinos, or if it is a mammal. And what's really amazing is that you can actually kind of see this in a little microcosm if you look at a developing mammal. And there's a phrase in biology that you may have heard if you've kind of done some preliminary courses, where people will say that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And what this means is that the changes that you see during a particular species development mirror the same changes that you would see if you're watching development over evolutionary time from one species to the next. So the idea being that if you look at the development of a particular embryo, and as that embryo becomes then a juvenile and later on an adult, that same pattern of changes that you see within the development of that one thing is the same sort of change that you would see over evolutionary time as you get one species and then the next, and having these organisms completely going from one type of animal to a whole new animal. And in fact, you can see this if you look, for example, at a developing possum, let's say. An opossum, as I'll talk a little bit about later, is a marsupial, so it's kind of a basal mammal, one of the earlier developing ones. So if you look at opossums as they're growing, you'll see that they look kind of reptilian in terms of their jaw very early on. So if you look at them at day one after birth, they look very much like a reptile. But if you keep taking x-rays over time and follow these animals through until they're adults, you'll notice that little by little you have these changes where the little bones will move away, they'll migrate into the inner portion of the ear, and by the time you're all done, you have an adult that looks like a full-on contemporary mammal. And it's a really amazing thing how you can kind of get an idea of how evolution might have progressed over time by looking at the development of something that's living today. Now there are also a lot of derived characters, so characters that are possessed by modern mammals. And these are things that maybe our extinct mammals or other synapses would not have shared with us, but they're something that one of our kind of more recent ancestors developed at some point and then passed down to the rest of us after that. And there are really two main things to focus on. The first of these is really what gives us our name as a group, and that's our mammary glands. And of course everyone knows that mammary glands are used to produce the milk that we use to feed our young offspring. But what's interesting is that milk is not just for giving nutrition. Now, it is a really good source of nutrition, and it provides lots of different things. And interestingly, if you look at different types of species, you'll find a big variation in terms of what the milk contains. And that's because different species will have different needs, and they'll also have different diets, and so they're just going to be able to extract different things from the environment at the time that they're breeding. For example, if you look at animals that are from really cold environments where they need to have a lot of blubber to keep them warm, they're burning a lot of energy to stay warm enough, you tend to find that their milk does contain lots and lots of fat because they need that fat in order to provide them the energy in order to deal with those really harsh environmental conditions. But animals that are in kind of easier environments maybe don't have that same fat content. So of course, yes, the number one reason that we have milk probably is as a source of nutrition. But when babies are feeding, they're also getting a lot of the stuff that was inside the mom. And this, there are several things that they can get that are really useful, but the point is that ultimately all those things do improve health. So for example, one thing that we get is antibodies. So if your mom has been exposed to some sort of an infection, she'll have antibodies to that in her blood already and in her system, and she can pass some of those on to you through her milk, which means that you don't have to be exposed to that same thing in order to then develop your own antibodies. She can kind of protect you from it beforehand, right from the start, so you aren't going to die when you're in that vulnerable juvenile stage. Another really important thing that we've recently found out a lot more about is microorganisms. And so a lot of the stuff, for example, that we have within our guts and within our system that can help us kind of deal with daily life, a lot of that we do get from our mothers during the birth process and sometimes even during feeding. So there are going to be, for example, bacteria and other microorganisms right on the surface of the mother. So when you've got a baby latching on to the teat in order to suckle, they're going to get stuff not only from within the milk, but also from the skin contact too. And all of that contact serves another purpose, which is to facilitate bonding between the mother and the child, and also to facilitate social development in general. So there's a lot of emphasis in humans about having that kind of contact for the mother to feed the young so the child develops normally and becomes intelligent and clever and all these things. But actually we do see similar patterns happening in other animals as well. So it is a very important thing in terms of helping that animal develop kind of normal relationships with other animals within its species. Now, one of the interesting things about the whole suckling process is that we tend to think that a baby will need to have a teat or nipple or whatever you want to call it in order to get access to the milk. But actually that's not true. So in monotremes, the mother will have milk being produced right from glands that are right in her skin. So basically she just kind of has a hole out of which the milk will come, and so the babies can get access to that by suckling on her fur. So the milk will kind of condense, if you like, in the fur, and it will group there so the babies can just suck it off of the fur, and that's how they get their nutrition. So you don't even need the kind of basic breast structure or nipple structure that we tend to think about whenever we think about suckling young. Now, here I have mentioned fur, which is a really nice segue into the fact that the other derived characteristic that mammals have in common is hair. And hair, of course, we all have it, or used to have it, or had it at some point. And we know that there are these filaments that grow from follicles that are living in our skin. And if you look at hair a bit more closely, it is kind of interesting. And it has this tripartite structure. So you've got a center called the medulla, and around that you've got a cortex that's made up of keratin bundles. And the cortex is what's important for giving coloration. So depending on what type of pigments you've got in there, what their distribution is, what their density is, you're going to have different colors of hair. And I just kind of wanted to throw that out there in case people are interested about hair color. Now you know, it all has to do with the structure of the hair and what sort of pigment and what sort of arrangement of pigment you've got in that second layer of your hair. And then all of that's going to be covered up then by the cuticle, which is a bunch of kind of overlapping shingle-like structures that keep all of that central bit safe. Now the hair follicle is what's responsible for growing the hair. It's a little tiny organ, and the shape of the follicle is what influences the shape of the cortex, and this then will affect the resulting fiber shape that grows out as that hair becomes longer and longer. And that is going to influence, as you might expect, whether your hair is curly or straight. So again, that's just a little bit of a tangent from the mammalian topic, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a bonus so that you know a little bit more about hair, because hair is an important structure that makes us kind of unique as animals. And I should also mention, before I move on and think about the purpose of hair, you might be thinking, well, there are some mammals that don't really have hair. Like if you're picturing whales or dolphins in your head, you might think, well, those things don't have hair, do they? Well, it is true that after a while you can have animals losing characteristics that had evolved. So it is true, just like we have no longer got those holes in our skull the way that our fellow animals do, you can lose things over time. But the point is that most mammals will have hair, and actually if you look at whales, the tubercles that some whales have on their skin, so those big kind of lumpy things, those do appear to be a derived hair characteristic. So there are follicles in the center of that, and this just seems to be kind of an unusual, strange looking to us adaptation. It's just what hair became in those particular animals. So in fact, you might be seeing hair and just not recognizing it. So why do mammals have all this hair? What does it do? Well, obviously one of the big things is that it keeps us warm. Of course, if you're thinking about animals that live in the coldest climates, those tend to be things that are extremely furry. So things like oxen that have really big coats, like those musk oxen, things like polar bears, all those sorts of really furry, dense animals, those have nice warm coats of fur. And I should say that generally hair is thought of as the individual components and also that kind of outer bit, and fur tends to be what we use, the term we use to refer to lots of hairs together, or a coat that has multiple layers of hair, so different types of hairs. We'll call that fur. So you can kind of, it's a bit colloquial and scientific. It can be confusing how you should use each of these terms. So I'm being kind of broad here in how I use this today. Another thing that hair is good for is that it allows us to indicate emotions. So for example, if you see a cat that gets really angry or afraid, it will raise the fur on its back, and that kind of signals that it is upset and maybe shouldn't be approached. It can also be used to attract mates, and a great example of that is lion manes. So lion manes, the females that will see those manes can be quite attracted by them, and we know, for example, that lions with dark manes tend to be more attractive than lions with lighter colored manes. We also know that hair can facilitate other sorts of kind of communication, because it allows us to have lots of different coloration and patterns that can be used to warn off organisms or confuse organisms that we don't want around us. So zebra stripes, for example, can be used to confuse predators so that they can't zero in on one animal. And skunk patterns can be used to say, this is a dangerous organism, don't get any closer, or something's going to happen that you don't like. And I have talked a little bit about that in the past when I've talked about camouflage and animal communication. Hair can also be used in defense. So before I was talking about some kind of interesting and unusual ways in which hair has changed, so those whale tubercles, for example. Well, also we find that porcupine quills and hedgehog bristles and other structures like that can also arise from hair. So over time, those hairs have become modified, they've been adapted to a different type of use. So those things probably aren't working so well to keep the animals warm, but they're really good to make sure that something's not going to pick them up or try to crunch into them and have a nice quick meal. And finally, another really important use of hair is to help us sense the environment. Now, we may not do this quite as much because, for example, we don't have whiskers. So whiskers are more scientifically known as vibrissae, and that's, for cats and dogs and things like that that have those big whiskers on their faces. But we all do have hair cells within our ears that help us hear, and this is another really important mammalian structure, is that the inner ear that allows us to hear as well as we do. And you'll probably remember, if you've had biology or some sort of medical study at some point, you know that we do have those little tiny ears that will bend as they're exposed to sound waves, and that will trigger the electrical response in our minds that allows us to know that we've heard some sort of a sound. So hair does have a really extremely important purpose, just like the mammary glands, and these are the things that really help define what a modern mammal is and the characteristics that it has that we all share in common with each other. Welcome back to the Wild Side. That was Scott McKenzie singing San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, memorably played in the Forrest Gump soundtrack, which is why I happen to have that song. So today we're talking about mammals, and here in the last little bit that I have before I have to take off today, I want to talk a little bit about the different types of mammals that exist today. So I am going to get back into some phylogeny and evolutionary type stuff, but hopefully it'll be kind of interesting, and maybe you'll even learn something. So there are two subclasses of mammals that are living today, and the first group are the Prototheria, and the second group are the Theria. Now, Prototheria contains only one kind of group of mammals, and those are the monotremes, which I've mentioned already a few times today. And monotremes, there are only 5 species total, so there are 4 species of echidnas, and then there's the duck-billed platypus. And there used to be more species of these around, but they've gone extinct, and these are the only 5 that are left today. And Theria are all the other mammals, and that can be, again, broken down into 2 groups. So one of those is the marsupials, and marsupials are also known as Metatheria, and those are things like kangaroos and opossums and quoll and all sorts of cool animals in Australia that you've probably heard of. And then the other group is the placentals, and the placentals, and that's what we are, also known as the Eutheria, and these guys are cats, dogs, whales, primates, whatever you can think of. The majority of all mammals are placentals. Now, what's interesting is if you look, I keep looking at the roots of all of these terms, and the root for this is actually not the most helpful thing in the world. So Theria basically just means wild beast, and really all of these things could be considered wild beasts. So having Theria in the name of each one of these is not all that useful. So Prototheria is kind of becoming a wild beast, Metatheria is kind of a larger group of wild beasts, and then Eutheria means the true wild beasts. So I'm not really sure who thought that was the most descriptive term ever. But indeed, all of those names do refer to the fact that these are animals. So there you go, in case you hadn't noticed that already. Now, thinking about each one of these groups, the monotremes are kind of, I don't want to say that they are not, very developed or exciting animals, because that's not true at all, and that kind of goes along with that idea that we tend to have of things being more evolved or less evolved, and that's not at all what I mean. But they are quite basal, so they're some of the earliest mammals that emerged. They do have some very early and old characteristics of those mammals, like I talked about earlier, the Dimetrodon or Dimetrodon, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, and the Morganocodon, all these organisms that are kind of beginning to change from that reptile-like ancestor into the mammals that we know today. Monotremes are right at that point in time where you do finally have that switch over from reptilian background, but still having a lot of those reptile-like traits. So it's quite interesting to look at them because it's kind of like looking back in time. These animals are still alive today, but they do have some of those characteristics that evolved very early on. And these guys did in fact appear about 200 million years ago, so very close to the time when Morganocodon was in existence. And like our reptile ancestors, they do lay eggs. The name monotreme does mean single hole and refers to the fact that they have a cloaca that they use to lay their eggs and also to do all the other things like weeing and whatnot that an animal needs to do. So they've got just the single hole there, which is where the name of the group comes from. And once they've laid the eggs, they will put them in a pouch that's attached to the mother, so she will carry the eggs around with them and keep them safe wherever she goes. And as I mentioned earlier, she does secrete the milk through openings in her skin rather than through defined nipples, and this is quite an unusual thing that we don't see in any of the other groups. Another kind of unusual characteristic is that the adults have no teeth once they grow up. Some of them are capable of electroreception, They tend to have a very low metabolic rate, which is kind of a holdover from those reptilian ancestors. And again, this, as we have evolved, and I'll talk about this later on at some point, we do have quite a lot of energy that we put into keeping our body temperature the way it is. And one of the reasons that we are able to do that is that we tend to have higher metabolism than reptiles and birds and other creatures in that group. So it's kind of unusual that monotremes do have that very low metabolic rate. They also have a gait that's very similar to the gait that's found in reptiles. So if you watch these things move, you'll notice that the positioning of their legs and their arms and their feet is very similar to how a reptile body plan is. So they move in kind of a reptile-like way, rather than scurrying around like a little mouse might, for example. And you're probably familiar enough with these sorts of species already to know that all of them can be found in Australia and New Guinea and nowhere else in the world outside of zoos. So these are animals that are found in kind of a small area, an isolated bit. They probably once were distributed in a more widespread way, but they have died out, and this is where they're left over. Now, marsupials are a much younger group, if you like. They emerged about 90 million years ago, which is actually when the rest of mammals emerged as well. So there was kind of this split where you've got marsupials emerging in one way, and then kind of another suite of characteristics driving the rest of mammals, the placentals, into another subgroup of the mammalian order. And these guys give birth to really undeveloped young. They aren't giving birth to eggs like the monotremes, and they aren't giving birth to the sorts of babies that we have. They're basically giving birth to what practically looks like an embryo. And then that embryo will climb up and take shelter in something called a marsupium, which we call a pouch, and that's where they do their development. And they'll spend months and months there, and actually maybe in and out of the pouch for over a year. And baby marsupials are known as joeys. We tend to use that phrase just with kangaroos, but actually any marsupial baby is a joey. And these guys have really developed forelimbs, and they need to have those really strong arms because that's what they use to help them scramble up the belly of the mom and get into place in the pouch. And what they'll do is they'll find her nipple and latch onto that and stay in that position for a really long time until they are able to kind of hop around and can keep themselves warm and function on their own outside of the pouch. Now, marsupials do have a placenta, so one of the reasons that these guys are very closely related, more closely related to us than they are to the monotremes, is that we do have this kind of shared thing in terms of having a bit of a placenta, but it's not very developed in marsupials, and that of course is because the babies don't spend a very long time inside the mother, so they don't need to have much of a developed structure to help facilitate the flow of nutrients and getting the waste out of where the baby is developing and all that sort of stuff, because it's just not in there for very long. Another really strange and interesting thing about these animals is that the females have two vaginas, and so the males have evolved to have bifurcated penises, so that when they mate, each bit of the penis will go up into each bit of the female's reproductive tract and have kind of two simultaneous sexual events, if you like, at a single time. And that, of course, is quite unusual, and pictures of these things are quite interesting. They are very strange-looking structures. And these guys, we tend to think of them as being mostly from, again, Australia and the kind of Australasia area, but they are also found in the Americas. So we do have several different types of opossum that you can find in the U.S. Also South America, sorry, that was a bit narrow of me. I'm thinking of the things that I grew up with, but they are also further south as well. Now finally, right before I head off today, I do want to make brief mention of our own group, and that is the placentals. And as I mentioned, the placentals do have that placenta just like the marsupials do. So we do have that trait in common. They did emerge around the same time, about 90 million years ago. So when we split off from these other species, the monotremes. And our young develop in utero for quite a long period of time. So they come out having much more advanced stage of development. And that's why we do have longer pregnancies and that true placenta that connects the fetus to the wall of the uterus and allows the baby to really get the kind of nutrient that it needs to grow. And we have an extended care period also once the young come out. So not only do we take a longer time to gestate, we also take a longer time to take care of our babies before we have more reproduction or before the young are able to go take care of themselves and live independently. And one of the reasons that we do then have really complex social interactions and higher intelligence is because we do tend to then have group living, where you've got a mother with lots of offspring at once, you've got multiple mothers that might raise babies together, you've got both the male and female parent taking care of the baby. Now you do see these in other organisms as well, but one of the reasons that mammals have so much of this and such a high percentage is because of the massive amount of energy and time that's required to raise the young that we have. And mammals are found worldwide, of course, and not mammals, placentals are found worldwide, except for Antarctica, where we aren't there all of the time, but we do live there in some bits of the continent. So there are quite a lot of us, even if we aren't in certain areas all year round. And you can split these guys into 4 different lineages, but I won't go into that kind of evolutionary detail because it's a bit boring. But overall, if you look back at all these groups of mammals that I've been talking about, cumulatively they amount to 29 orders, 153 families, 1,229 genera, and about 5,400 different species. So that is quite a lot of diversity that we have. And that doesn't even include the large number of genera and families that have already gone extinct. And more of these species are discovered every single year, both in terms of fossil organisms and living organisms. 10 to 12 new organisms are found each year in the mammalian group. And the chances are that if you discover a new species, it's either going to be a rodent or a bat, because these are the 2 most common groups of all mammals. And these are followed by a group that contains shrews and moles and solenodons, and then right after that is primates. So actually we do represent a pretty big chunk of the family as well. And of course we already know that there's quite a lot of variation, so you've got giant things like blue whales, you've got tiny things like bumblebee bats, and you also have species that are found on only a single island to others that are found pretty much everywhere like humans. So it's an amazing amount of diversity, and we do lots of really interesting things. And that's why it's worth, I think, talking about what makes mammals and who are we and who are we related to. And hopefully in the future I'll do another show where I talk a bit about mammal behavior, so how we survive and the sort of interesting things we do and some of the other cool adaptations that we have. And I think that is it for today, so I will leave you with a bit of Shelby Lynne before Stanley comes in to take over. So thanks a lot for listening, and this is Family Tree.